Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We are with Quintessence last, our level 30 brute who has a 1.25 million experience, earned 56,000 to go to get to the next level, which will get us some more slots. 23 million influence. We want to try to get a couple more mil by the time a few days go by, because I think we have enough reward merits to get another one of these brute set archetype sets, and we're trying to finish that up. I want to say we might be able to get it by 32 and fill Shadow Maul with it, or perhaps Smite, depending on what I do with my slots. But right now we're on a story arc for Buck Salinger, who says, I think I've uncovered a way to strike at the Redcaps. They seem to be hoarding all the iron in the area. Fake creatures, as I'm sure you know, are afraid of iron. It can harm them quite grievously. If you would go into the caves and recover their iron hoard, I think we could really hit them where it hurts. Okay, but we're not going to kill anybody, right? Because we are heroes. Alright, so we're heading over here, and I'm guessing we got another outdoor mission, but we'll see. Maybe there's a cave. There are some cave openings here. And we need to put stealth back on. We took it off because we were escorting hostages, but we shouldn't have any hostages to escort in this mission. And in we go. So this is the tunnels. And we need to find 5 hordes. And these are just red caps. Let's change our jump to combat jumping so we don't overuse our endurance. Oh, one of them turned into a lieutenant. That's kind of cool. Let's do a soul drain. Yeah, I haven't fought red caps in a while, so I forgot they could do that. As you can see, with the extra toggle on, we are starting to lose endurance as we go, but it's not a problem with this character because we can always absorb more endurance if we need to. Like so. And we're back to full. These guys seem to hit an awful lot. I wonder what their 2-hit is. He's only 24%, so I'm not sure why they're hitting me quite so much. Of course, he's at 24% after I hit him a few times. They might have been at around 40% without, which would mean they have a fairly high base to hit. Alright, let's just head in. Fight them all. See if we can get some AoEs going here. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. We got 3 guys in 1 AoE. That's exactly what we want. Yeah, I like fighting these guys. They're a bit of a challenge. Pretty cool. So, as we go, let's talk about role-playing game theory and practice, I guess. Once again, this is something that was triggered by a conversation on the D&D Beyond forum, but it doesn't just apply to Dungeons & Dragons, although perhaps it applies to... I don't want to say perhaps it applies to it more. It applies to it particularly because there are arguments about essentially biological determinism in as much as it affects D&D in terms of racial stat bonuses and the like. But the argument actually doesn't, it goes beyond that. One of the people posting there was talking about things like, well, having a halfling who's 3 feet tall be able to lift, be stronger than a or as strong as a Goliath who's 7 feet tall and has like twice the bone mass and 3 times the muscle mass or whatever. It sort of breaks the laws of physics, and I guess what he was saying for himself was it destroys verisimilitude. Now, I don't completely agree with that. I think that verisimilitude's great, but if somebody wants to play a really powerful halfling, that's fine. But the counter argument was, well, this is a magical world, and the laws of physics don't apply here. And I think that that's not the right answer, right? The right answer is that on average, halflings are a lot weaker than Goliaths, but this particular halfling fighter is stronger than other halflings and may be stronger than a single Goliath. And that's fine, as long as we don't try to argue that halflings as a group aren't any weaker than Goliaths, which doesn't make any sense at all because they're a lot smaller. And so there is a group of people, not just in D&D, but in role-playing games, who argue from first principles of biology, chemistry, and physics, and another group of people in role-playing games who say it's magic, it's superheroes, it's whatever, and so the rules of physics shouldn't apply, and chemistry and biology. And I don't agree with that either. I mean, I think that as a general proposition, the default assumption should be that unless otherwise stated and unless there's a really good reason otherwise, that the rules of physics absolutely should apply in every role-playing game as much as possible. And the reason is that physics is the reference. Physics, biology, chemistry, that is referencing the real world, and we need that reference to be able to understand what the heck is going on in a world. Yes, this character has super jump, right? But the developers of this game were incredibly careful to make the super jump act like it would act if it existed in the real world. In other words, it moves in a parabolic arc, right? It goes, the jumping trajectory is bigger and gets you to go farther than the real world. But it's the same basic shape and consistency, whatever else, that has the same basic physical characteristics of a long jump in the real world. It just goes farther, right? Similarly, if you are teleporting and you're teleporting up in the air, right, and you stop teleporting, gravity still exists and you still fall to the ground and take damage. Now, maybe you don't take enough damage for it to kill you the way it would kill a non-superhuman person, but you're still going to fall and you're still going to take damage, right? And this is true for, many of the superpowers. When these guys fire their arrows, the arrows follow a trajectory that's basically the kind of trajectory that you would see in a normal arrow being fired from a normal bow. Yes, it's super powered and does more damage, but it's still following the same basic principles of the world. This cave has a sandy floor with rocks around it, and you can't just walk through rock, right? You can't just ignore the physical laws as we know them. The game is made with an engine that is designed to mimic in nearly every particular the real world. The lighting, the way cars drive on the street, the way the tile sets are made. It's all designed to mimic the real world as much as possible, and then you just tweak it to allow there to be superheroes, right? But the actual physics is very, very similar to the real world. And why do they do that? Because it's familiar. Because they don't then have to explain to you what rocks are and how they work, or what gravity is in this world and how it works. They just follow the gravity and the rocks and the stones and the concrete and the automobile physics and the jumping physics of the real world, and just, when necessary, amp them up to 11 to make them superheroic, right? And so this is really important in a role-playing game. It needs to mimic the real world in all the ways that aren't specific to the game system. and in many ways that are specific to the game system. People cite D&D as having magic. Yes, D&D has magic, but the spell Fireball still creates something that we would recognize in the real world as a ball of fire. The fire acts like fire. It burns things. It singes things. It chars things. It acts a lot like a hand grenade explosion would act. It's a ball of fire, right? When you create like an ice storm, it still will create a slippery surface that you might fall down on because there's still gravity in the D&D world, and there's still such a thing as having balance, and there's still such a thing as a possibility of falling down and breaking your leg or what have you. When you fall down a pit, there's falling damage, 1d6 per 10 feet of damage, and it is still meant to mimic as well as possible what it would be like to fall in the real world. Yes, hit points are an abstraction. Yes, armor class is an abstraction, but they still, it's not like cloth armor is a better armor class than plate mail, right? Plate mail still is the heaviest armor and provides you with the most protection, and it's still made out of metal, and that metal is some kind of iron or steel or bronze. It's not made out of lollipops, right? And when you cast the spell Water Breathing, you're still breathing, right? You're still breathing in water. It's not allowing you to inhale wood. And so most of the physics of a D&D or a Champions or a City of Heroes world actually is and should be like real world physics, and then we just change it where it's necessary to change it, right? So halflings can have a 20 strength and can be fighters just like a Goliath can, right? But we don't try to declare that on average halflings aren't any less strong and physical and imposing than Goliaths. That doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, I mean, we have a shared language, and we have a shared sense and a shared knowledge of how the universe works. And every time you say it's not going to work that way, you now have to make up a new set of rules. Well, the one guy was saying, well, nobody has DNA in my world. Okay. Does that mean, it seems to mean that the beings in your world, the humans and whatever, don't have cells, right? And that's going to have consequences. Do the people in your world breathe? Do you need a water breathing spell to go underwater? Yes. Okay. Why? Well, they have to be able to breathe. What are they breathing? I mean, when you inhale, what are you breathing? Air. Well, air is made up of nitrogen, oxygen, and a couple of other small things. You don't use the nitrogen, it just goes in and out. So you need oxygen. Why do you need oxygen? You need oxygen because your cells are using aerobic respiration to do the electron transport chain inside your cells. You have membrane-bound organelles, and one of those organelles is the mitochondria, and in the mitochondria you have an electron transport chain, and it's transporting electrons, and the final electron acceptor is oxygen. Without oxygen, the electron transport chain would stop, your cell wouldn't be able to generate ATP, and it would die. But if you don't have cells, you don't need ATP, and you don't need oxygen. So why do the characters breathe? Do they have lungs? Do they have blood? Why do you have lungs and blood? Blood, if you're cut, are you bleeding? I mean, do they bleed, or does like crystal fall out of their bodies? Have you thought about this as a DM, right? No, it's just, oh, there's no DNA in my world. Why? Well, because I just don't want it to be, right? You got to think about these things. It's not that you can't have a fantasy world where there's no DNA and there are no cells, but then you're going to have to think about, what are people breathing? Why are they breathing at all? Why do they need to breathe? Do they need to breathe? If they don't have lungs and they're not breathing in air and taking air in and out of their lungs, how do they speak? Because we speak by forcing air through the voice box, the larynx, from our lungs going up through the throat. If you don't breathe and you don't have any lungs, how can your larynx work? Have you thought about that? Right? Well, it's just magic. They just hand wave and it's just magic. But is a fireball still burning fire? If no physics from the real world works in your world, why do you have fireballs? Why do you have ice storm? Why do you have water breathing? Those all presuppose that water, ice, and fire work the same way in the D&D world that they work in our world. Your world doesn't have oxygen. Okay, how does fire burn? Well, it burns what? Methane? Well, what is going on in the world that you don't need all of these things? And so it's just so much easier to make the assumption that everything is like we know in the universe, except that there's some magic in it that can allow you to break the laws a little bit, right? Fireball is not creating something that doesn't exist in the world. It's creating something that exists in the world in an unusual way with a magic spell instead of having to pull a pin off a hand grenade that's full of a chemical and is going to explode when you pull the pin, right? Instead of making a chemical explosion, you're making a magical explosion, but the explosion is still an explosion and it still does the same things that explosions do, right? When you set a fire, things burn. When you cover something in water, it gets wet. When do if is there no water in your world? Well, how do plants exist? Right? I mean, I had to think about this. I created the astral when I created the astral sea. I realized there can't be any plants because there's no sun, right? So there's no photosynthesis. So there's this weird sort of bluish grass that doesn't actually really grow. It just sort of sits there. It's almost like the equivalent of plastic. And there's no rain, there's no wind, and there's no sun because it's not Earth, right? And the reason there's rain and wind on Earth is because there's a sun and an atmosphere. And the atmosphere, the sun heats up the ocean, and the water evaporates and creates clouds, and the clouds cause rain, and the heat differential between different parts of the world creates wind currents where the winds are going up and down, and then the Earth's rotation is deflecting the winds left and right, and so you get prevailing winds that lead to storms and all of this. If you have this flat sea with no rotation and it's not on a world, none of that's going to exist, right? So I had to make up all of these rules for the astral sea because the regular physics don't work. You can't just say the regular physics don't work, but I'm not going to make up any other rules. And most of these people aren't making up any rules. They're just saying, well, the rules that I don't like don't work that way, but I'm not going to make up any substitutes for them. And that you shouldn't do because that's what destroys not only verisimilitude, but our ability to understand what each other's talking about. Let's talk to him and then we'll continue. He says, thank you, Quintessence Lass. I'll get this iron back to its owners, except for this piece, this blade. Belonged to my grandfather, you see. I've kept something of a memento. I've kept it as something of a memento, but now I want you to have it. At least for a while, I think it'll be a better use for you than my grandfather. So we've now got the iron blade, which I guess will help us against these guys. I'm going to keep that there because it's a melee attack, and it looks like a good one. Pretty big. How much damage does this do? Oh, wow. 145 damage. That's pretty nice. I mean, even Shadow Maul only does an average of about 60. Seems like we do more than that. It must do 60 per hit, because I feel like we, like 30-30. I feel like we do a lot more than 60. Okay, let's talk to Buck, who says, exploiting the weakness of the Redcaps will be the key to defeating them. Quintessence Lass, use the blade well. Then he says, a friend of mine may be in trouble. His name's Dashel, Walter Dashel. He's a member of the Magi. Not the most talented mystic you'll ever meet, but very talented when it comes to summoning spells. Last I heard, he was working on ways to summon the varied creatures of Croatoa. I imagine that's why the Redcaps came after him. I need you to travel to the spirit world and bring Dashel back. He's a good man, and he's in trouble. It's within the spirit realm. Now be careful, Quintessence Lass. From the intelligence I've received, it sounds like this gathering is truly massive. Well, we should be fine. We've got the actual blade now that we can use against them. So yeah, I mean, again, I'm not saying that you can't change the physics of a world. You certainly can, and sometimes I've done that when I make up worlds, as I did with the astral plane. But the more you change, the more you say the physics isn't the way we know it in the real world, the more replacements for reality you have to make up, the more consequences there are going to be. My dwarves, one guy says, don't have a blood type. Didn't say whether they have blood, just that they don't have a blood type. And we're going to look around for Walter Dashel as we talk. And so they don't have a blood type. Let's imagine that it's because they don't have blood. They don't have a circulatory system. Are these dwarves immune from poison? Because the way most poisons work is the poison gets into your finger by pricking the finger or whatever, gets into you at one point, but then it is spread throughout the body by your circulatory system, and that's how all the damage is done, right? Otherwise, it would just stay in your finger and it wouldn't do anything. What the poison needle is doing is getting into your heart, your lungs, your liver, your kidneys, whatever, and making those organs kind of go bad, right? There's damaging those organs, and that ultimately kills you. And of course, you need the kidneys to clean out the blood. If you don't have any blood, why do you need kidneys? How if you don't have any cells, you're not making any metabolic waste, right? There are all of these potential consequences, and you can say, "Well, I'll just wave our hands and say it's magic." But have you thought about it? Have you really thought about what the consequences are of saying, "quote unquote," it's just magic and it doesn't work? Whoa! Did you guys see that? I bet I'm not going to be able to replicate it now. I'm glad I caught it on video. We went this way. Yeah, look at that. That is weird. That's like a weird visual artifact. Very strange. I thought I saw something on this side, so we're going to head back over. Thought I saw something big and boss-like over here. Nope. Let's keep looking. There he is. Alright, now we came in over there. I don't know if we're going to have to lead him out. We probably will. So let's clean up. Let's sort of clean the way up, you know, like clear the way there out so that when we go to take him, we don't have to fight everybody here. Let's try the sword. Cool. And I taunted him over because I don't want to get into the boss, because then we're going to free Dashel, and then we're going to have to fight our way out with Dashel with us, and I really don't want to have to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really, you have to be careful what you're going to decide to change. So much of what we assume in role-playing games is based on the real world. As I said to the one player who said that, he said my how did he say it? He said my dwarves are made of clay, and my gnomes are made of gems, and my halflings are made of clay, my dwarves are made of rocks, and my gnomes are made of gems, or they were formed from those things by the gods. And I said, yes, but is your clay? Right? Is it a small part, the smallest of the three soil particles, the larger ones being silt and sand? And does it, like, if you do pottery with it, will it form the same sorts of things as the kinds of pottery we're used to in the real world, right? Or if you, or is your clay like styrofoam packing peanuts? And I assume your clay is like clay because you called it clay and not styrofoam packing peanuts. Are your rocks like rocks, or are they like lollipops? Are your gems like gems, or are they like sponges? Right? I mean, how much of your world is completely different versus actually the same as the way ours works? All right? I mean, look at this map. The trees are trees. The grass is grass. Right? It's not like you walk onto the grass and you could be swimming, because grass works the same way here as it works in the real world. When you punch somebody, you do damage. It's not the case that when you punch somebody, they heal. You know what I mean? Things mostly work here the way they work in the regular world, and that allows you to play the game without having to look up what water is, without having to look up what fire is, without having to look up what stone is. And so this is something that I think a lot of people are not are missing and are not really thinking about, in not just in this thread but in general with D&D. And I've seen this in, even in like City of Heroes as well. If somebody complains that X or Y is completely unrealistic, the response is always, well, it's a superhero game, it doesn't have to be realistic. But you need most of the world to actually be realistic so that the superpowers are superpowers. Otherwise, everything is just, you know, the sun is a lollipop and the water is licorice, and um, the moon is actually made of green cheese, and a punch is a kiss, and a kiss is a stab, and nothing makes any sense, right? And again, you now have to define everything because there's no common set of knowledge. There's no common set of physical laws that we all understand to be just generically true. Gravity doesn't work the way we think it works. So when you're teleporting and you stop teleporting, instead of falling down, you fall up, or maybe you fall forward and slam into the war walls. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense, and it would confuse the heck out of everybody. So yes, you want to have the freedom to make cool superpowers and allow people to fly, but when they're flying, you want the flying to work the way the physics of flying ought to work, in a way that it's recognizable to people, right? When I super jump, that the jump moves that I'm doing are recognizable to me and you and everybody watching and everybody playing a super jump character as a jump, right? I don't start swimming in lollipops when I turn on the jump power. And the jump power doesn't work in some strange way like having me zigzag left and right. I go up and down in a smooth parabolic arc, much the way a real world jump works. And therefore, it's understandable to us as a jump, and we can negotiate it very easily. If instead every time I press the up button we randomly teleported somewhere, that wouldn't be a jump, right? And it would confuse the heck out of everybody trying to jump. And so one of the things that you have to be really careful about when you're making up a world in D&D, and they have to be very careful about when making up the rules of D&D, is that you need the rules of the world to mostly follow the rules of reality so that people can understand the parts that don't, right? If 99% of the rules work the way we expect them, you can explain the 1% of the world that has magic missile and fireball and lightning bolt coming out of people's hands. But the magic missile still flies on a trajectory like a crossbow bolt, and the lightning bolt still cracks like a bolt of lightning. And the fireball still burns things. It doesn't make them wet, you see. And so I think it's really important to have the game work in a way that is understandable and makes sense and is consistent with the real world, so that everybody understands what they're seeing when they're in an encounter, right? I mean, after all, these same people saying, oh, it's not the real world, do they use range modifiers? Why are the range modifiers there? They're there because of the way gravity works, right? Because when you shoot a bow, the arrow is eventually going to fall to the ground. And the farther you shoot it, the more the farther it's going to fall, right? And so at some point, no matter how high up you aim, the thing is going to hit the earth because of gravity. And so if you're going to say, well, gravity doesn't work on my world, then did you change the range modifiers? Or are you leaving them that way? Right? I mean, all these things are connected. And so it's really important to think about, what are you actually doing and what changes are you actually making? And just change as little as possible, so that is an awesome hit, by the way. Change as little as possible so that the world works as much as possible like the real world, and all you're doing is just tweaking the parts you need to get your world to be cool and unique and different. Just tweaking the physics so that we can have magic. Right? Is this guy summoning furbolgs to help us? It looks like it. Cool. Right? When these guys jump up, they only go a certain height. Why? Because there's gravity in this world. And when we run along the ground. Why? Because there's gravity in this world. Right? And when the fire hits, they continue to burn for a while after they get hit. Why? Because when fire hits when fire hits things, things burn. Right? I mean, this is all mimicking the way the real world works. And all they're doing is saying all this real world stuff works, but you can shoot it out of your fingertips too. But when you shoot it out of your fingertips, it works like the real world stuff. You see? And so this makes it so that we have a common frame of reference and we can actually understand what's going on in the game and understand what the game master is telling us and this sort of thing. And so it really doesn't work to just say hand wave and say, "Oh well, any rule that I don't like just doesn't work that way because magic." That's not a useful way to that's not a useful way to do it. Are we going to be able to get this guy up? See, we got to come up here. Why? Because physics, he can only jump so far. Right? And that makes sense. You can understand what's going on in the world. Right? On the other hand, if he could just walk through the rocks, that would make it really hard to even understand what the heck's going on. Right? Especially if he could just do it without warning. Right? Just randomly do it just because physics doesn't work in this world. That would make it really hard to understand what's going on. So, if you're designing a world, if you're coming up with a universe, yes, make it cool, make it different if necessary. Change whatever rules of physics, gravity, etc. that you need to make your world cool and interesting, just like I did with my astral plane. But don't change too much, right? My characters we still ran 24-hour days, right? And the way I handled it was I gave them an hourglass. Somebody gave them an hourglass, and they just said, okay, well, we'll pay attention to it and flip it over every hour. And I didn't make them tell me who's flipping it each hour, right? I just said, okay, you guys this is how you're keeping track of time. And then we track time. And I use the months of the days of the months of the real world, right? Of their home world, because that's how you figure out time. Otherwise, they wouldn't know when do we take a long rest, when do we take a short rest, when do we have to eat, right? Their bodies still need food. They still need sleep. They still need to rest. Because that's how biology works, right? If you have a dwarf who's made out of rocks and he doesn't have blood, DNA, cells, or need to breathe, then the question is, why does he have to take a long rest? Why does he have to take a short rest? Why does he have to sleep? Now you got to make up all these rules about resting for dwarves because they're not made up of biological tissue and they don't have to follow the same rules of resting as everybody else. So it just gets so complicated. It's easier to just say, look, they're made out of flesh and blood. They have DNA and cells. We're just not going to worry about it because it's a fantasy game and who cares? And then you don't have any of these other considerations that you have to now think about, questions you have to answer, and all these logical inconsistencies that happen, which occur when you are going to say that none of the laws of physics work in my world because magic. All right, let's see. What does he say? He says, according to Dashiell, 3 of his fellow mystics are still missing. We should track them down. So that's going to be our task in the next episode, but I think we're going to stop here, guys. I've got a whole bunch of enhancements to sell. I'll do that off screen. Until next time, I am Scarpalock, and this is City of Heroes.